Our first true keynote speaker is here that's actually a recovering lawyer turned life coach. And she has over 15 years of experience doing equity work, and is here today to talk about what we can do on a personal level to help advance equity in the workplace. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie Ghoston Paul from Cultivated Sense to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning. How are folks doing? Good? Okay, coffee's kicking in. It's a good thing. Thank you for the introduction. I have to tell people up front that I'm a recovering lawyer just so we can get it out of the way. So people either love us or hate us, and I don't want you to find out at the end. So just get it out. I am really excited to be up here talking with you all today about building an ecosystem of one. I really want to talk about the fractal nature of equity work. So the work that I do is working with organizations who want to be more equitable and inclusive. And when they come to me, what we really are engaged in is some deep, radically transformative culture and identity work. So basically, I'm working with companies who are having an identity crisis and they don't really even know it. They're asking a lot of questions about who are we? Who do we serve? Who are we accountable to? How do we get in alignment with who we think we are, who we say we are, and who we want to be? And ultimately, the work that I'm doing with folks is, it's not about equity as a one-time endeavor or a siloed effort. It's really figuring out how do we make equity and inclusion the core of our identity, such that it's the lens through which we see and do everything. All theory, practice, and experience points to, if we want that radical transformation, we've got to have change on multiple levels. We've got to have individuals having a shift of heart and mind. Once individual folks are able to do that, they start to change the way that they interact with other individuals, which shifts cultural norms. If we are engaging in our communities and our cultures differently, institutions have to follow suit. So institutions have to transform their policies, their practices, how they engage with other institutions, and then we can start to see some systemic change. 95% of the organizations I work with, however, really only want to deal in the institutional and systemic level change. Sometimes they're willing to dive into the community and cultural aspects, and they have certainly not signed up for personal work. I've had a lot of people say, I read all of the fine print, Stephanie. I did not see anything that says that I personally have to change. I don't give refunds, so. But how it usually happens is this. Companies are coming to me and they have some big goals. So I had an organization come and say, Stephanie, we want to eliminate racism. It was right in their mission. And I was like, you are gonna owe me a lot more money than we originally talked about. And I am a recovering lawyer, but I haven't figured out how to have those multi-lifetime contracts. I don't know how to sign up myself for the next lifetime to help you do that. I've also worked with organizations that are figuring out how do we reduce poverty. We're seeing the same groups of people get richer and richer, and the same groups of folks being made poorer and poorer, and we want to do something about that. I've also worked with groups who are trying to figure out how do we disrupt or eliminate or do something about that school to prison pipeline. But again, their focus is usually on the institutional level. They'll say, please come in, put an equity lens onto our policies, but they don't look at the cultural and the individual aspects. I think there's a few reasons for that hyper-focus on the institutional. I think it's part of dominant culture, and it's part of our human nature. And even though that is very predictable, it doesn't mean that it's not problematic. So when we talk about dominant culture wants us to measure change and progress in a very particular way. Dominant culture asks us for tangible, concrete, numerical data to show change. If you think about our grant requirements or how we report to our stakeholders, that's typically how change is measured. We like to feel good about going from one percentage last year to another percentage the next year. And at the same time, that cultural and individual site of change, we don't often measure them in the same way, and they're definitely not valued in the same way as that numerical data. I also think the hyper-focus on the institutional piece has something to do with human nature. And what I know about humans, working with them for a very long time, is that we are multidimensional, messy, complicated, complex beings. We can hold multiple truths at one time. And I think that hyper-focus reflects both a self-sabotaging aspect and a self-preservation aspect. The self-sabotage really comes in when people start to recognize the sheer volume of work that has to be done. Last year, I was working with a housing organization here in Portland, and we were spending about a year together. So 6 months into the endeavor, they started to realize just how big this thing was. They said, Stephanie, we have to shift as a housing agency, but we also have to look at other housing agencies in the area and in the region and across the country. And then they started to realize, well, it's not just housing, it's real estate, it's banking, as we just mentioned, it's education, it's government, all these other institutions and all these other people that also have to make a shift. And I think that realization really started to sink in, and people started to get overwhelmed. They started to feel drained and tired. And I see that over and over again in institutions when they start to realize how much work actually has to be done. At the same time, that realization is an act of self-preservation. I've seen this time and time again. When folks start to recognize that there are other people that need to change, all of a sudden, I actually don't need to do anything. As long as there's someone out there, whether they're across the country or across the street, then I can stay where I'm at. I can preserve my status of being a good person or one of the good ones or an ally, right? I don't actually have to change. And that realization is really based on a faulty notion of neutrality, that somehow we as individuals are not connected to or impacted by larger systems at hand. So I actually want to do a quick poll for folks just to see where people are. I'm going to ask you to be honest with yourselves and with me and the colleagues in the room. I'm going to ask 2 questions. The first question is, how many people here feel like they can clearly explain, either to a neighbor, someone behind you, to someone in your company, how your company is impacting or is impacted by larger systems? Raise your hand if you feel like you can do that. See quite a few hands. Go ahead and put them down. That makes sense to me, right? As folks who are in the B Corp economy, you have to be able to explain. My company is doing this. Here's how we're impacting the planet. Here's the larger mission at hand, right? Here's how we're impacting houselessness or racism or sexism. Now, for the second question, how many people here feel like on an individual level, apart from any role you play in any company or organization, how many folks feel like they can just as clearly explain how they are impacting or impacted by those same systems? Raise your hand. Some folks, yeah. And I think this is pretty typical. Thank you for being honest. I think this is pretty typical that a lot of folks feel like on an organizational level, They feel clear that the systems are at play, and they know how their company is impacting those systems. And yet somehow when we walk outside of those four walls, we are suddenly immune to those systems. And I think that some folks think that because there's no active victim or someone that we're actively hurting, that we are immune or we're outside or we can act outside of systems. And in organizations, I explain it somewhat like this, that people believe that there are three separate things going on an organizational level, a community level, and then there's just little old me. And I'm outside of those two realms. The reality is that we are interconnected. Individuals make up culture. Individuals make up institutions. Individuals are at the table making policies and programs and procedures in those institutions. And we come with a lifetime of bias. We come with a lifetime of experiences that tell us what we know to be true about ourselves and others. And we bring that into our communities and our institutions, which ultimately means that we are not neutral. I'm not neutral. You are not neutral. Every belief, every thought, every pattern that we have is a reflection of or in resistance to larger systems at hand. And those thoughts and beliefs and patterns cause us to act and behave in a very particular way, such that our interactions are an exchange of power. There's nothing we can do that's outside of the systems that we've been conditioned into. And so I am advocating for folks to take a look at what is the individual work that we need to do. I started thinking about this after reading Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy. How many folks are Adrienne Maree Brown? Yes, okay. Some folks know Adrienne Maree Brown. Excellent book, I recommend it. Adrienne Maree Brown, in her book Emergent Strategy, talks about this idea of fractals, right? And what she believes is that what we do on the small scale sets the pattern for the larger system. So the small things are the large things. She says the same spiral structure and pattern that we see on seashells can be found in galaxies, right? So she's inviting us to figure out how, if we want to transform the world, we would have to transform ourselves. How can we start to see our own lives, our relationships, our work as the front lines for the justice, liberation, and freedom that we want to see in this world? She believes that we are micro systems of the larger systems, and so do I. Now, when I was translating this principle to organizations, I stopped using the word fractal. I think people think like fractal, math, numbers, and then like the eyes start to glaze over. So the word that I use that makes sense to me in my brain is really about ecosystems, right? So if we wanted to impact a large ecosystem, that ecosystem can be broken down into smaller pieces. And if we want to attack change at the large, we have to start with the small. And in company contexts, sometimes this looks like organizations want to enact an organization-wide policy. They have 50 people. I advocate maybe we should start with 5. Because if 5 people can do it, then 10, then 20, then 40, then it can spread out, right? And if we think about the smallest iteration of an ecosystem, that's the individual. So if we want to eliminate racism on a large scale, we would have to look at the ways in which it manifests through and impacts us individually. If we want to interrupt the school to prison pipeline, maybe it might be easier if we start by interrupting our racist, sexist, homophobic uncle at dinner, right? And so I advocate for folks to be thinking about what is the individual work that needs to be done to impact the larger system. Now, when I give this charge, I typically have to give a couple of disclaimers because these things come up over and over again in the work that I do. And the first is really that when I'm advocating for individual work to be done, I'm actually not talking about individualism. So dominant culture has a value around rugged individualism. This like bootstraps, self-made, it's all about me, it's only me, I'm the only one that can do it. And I'm actually talking about the opposite of that, which is we have a responsibility as a community member to do our own part. Each of us here are a part of so many different communities, whether it's your family community, friends, faith or lack thereof, education, athletic or lack thereof, community, right? And as a community member of all those communities, we have to do our own work. And when we don't, we're actually slowing folks down. And we're actively thwarting the efforts that that group is doing. The other part is that in a world of multitasking and delegating, our individual work cannot be outsourced. I've seen this so many times. Folks are like, I have to have someone else educate me or tell me what I'm doing wrong. I don't know what I don't know, which makes sense. And I'm here to tell you that Google is your friend. And Google's feelings will never be hurt. I promise you. I promise, right? The harsh reality that we actually have to deal with is that a lot of those communities that we're part of are very segregated. They're homogenous. They're made up of people of the same identity. So not only do you have to do your individual work, but if you're going to step into community, start with those. I think there's this idea that we have to engage difference in order to learn. But the reality is we have to have white folks talking to other white folks about race and racism. Men have to be talking to other men about patriarchy and sexism. We gotta have cisgender folks talking to other cisgender folks. We don't have to engage folks who have been marginalized by us and our identities in order to learn and to do our individual work. And I think as we think about how do we actually engage in that work, I think there's a central question and a mindset that we can employ to start that. The question that I would put out there for folks is to think about, what are you individually practicing? And this comes from Adrienne Marie Brown as well. What she says is we're always practicing something. So what are you practicing? Are you practicing silence and inaction? Are you practicing guilt and defensiveness? Are you practicing amplifying other folks' voice, stepping back, passing the mic? Are you practicing stepping forward and using your voice in a way that you haven't used before? What is it that you need to unlearn or reprogram? Where do you need to deepen your understanding of or your education of? Where do you need to be critical about how you've been positioned and your status? What is it that you believe to be true about yourself, about other folks, and who benefits from you believing that the world is that way? The questions, I think, are not as important because, again, your work cannot be outsourced, so I can't give you the right questions. But I think what has to underlie that inquiry is really this idea of creative destruction. And so some folks might be familiar with that. I first heard of it doing some work with an incubator in Atlanta, which supports Black and brown female founders with a tech-enabled business. And the founder of that program was talking to a potential cohort, and she was talking about the need to be able to fail fast, to pivot, and to switch from one idea to the other. And she said a metaphor that really stuck with me, and to this day, I still use it. What she said was, a seed has to be willing to give up on its identity in order to transform. Whether it's into a vegetable or a flower or a garden or a field, the seed has to be willing to give up on something. If the seed doesn't give up its identity, it will stay a seed. And I think as humans, we have to do the same thing. if we are holding on so tightly to who we believe we are, who we want to be, our status or power, or again, as a good person or a good one or an ally, we will never get to where we need to get to. Ultimately, I want to leave y'all with this question that Adrienne Marie Brown asks, a form of this in her book. And I'm curious to know, are you willing to be transformed as much as you want to transform the world? And I think if we can ask that question, and how we answer that question is the key to deep, long-lasting, sustainable transformation for this planet for all people. Thank you very much.